Look behind the frames. All of them. Those were the last words my husband ever said to me. Not, "I love you," not, "Goodbye." Just that. A riddle whispered through cracked lips. Heavy with something I couldn't name. The nurse thought he was delirious. Morphine, she said, but the look in his eyes, sharp, pleading, almost urgent, told me it wasn't nonsense. He meant it. Whatever it was. Minutes later, the monitor flatlined. And just like that, 42 years of marriage ended with a mystery instead of a farewell. The next day blurred into casseroles, condolence cards, and the sound of pity wrapped in kindness. Friends spoke softly. Neighbors hugged too long. The pastor mumbled something about peace in heaven. I nodded through it all like a woman following stage directions in someone else's play. But at night, when the house went quiet, those 6 words came back to me. Look behind the frames. All of them. Everywhere I turned, they were there. Our photographs. Samuel in his Navy uniform. Samuel kissing my forehead under the oak tree on our wedding day. Samuel holding our first baby in the hospital. Beaming with pride. Dozens of moments frozen in time, framed. Hung, dusted, and left untouched. But now, I couldn't stop looking at them. It felt like the walls were watching me instead. On the 3rd night, when sleep wouldn't come, I wandered through the living room. The clock ticked too loudly. The lamplight flickered over the mantel where Samuel kept his medals, his reading glasses, and that one stubbornly crooked photo we'd never straightened. I reached out, meaning to fix it, and noticed something strange. The back of the frame wasn't sealed flat like the others. The edge bulged slightly, as if the backing paper had been lifted and pressed back down. My pulse quickened. It was probably nothing. A tear, old tape, still. My fingers itched. I carried the frame to the dining table, flipped it over, and carefully pried open the clips. The paper gave way with a soft tear. Something thin and yellowed slipped out and fluttered to the floor. An envelope. Faded, creased, sealed with wax, and written in my husband's neat, careful handwriting, E.W., for when silence is too loud. I stared at it for what felt like forever. The air in the room changed, heavy, charged. Part of me wanted to open it immediately. Another part of me wanted to burn it, pretend I'd never found it. Because somehow, I already knew. Whatever truth waited inside that envelope wasn't meant to comfort me. It was meant to change everything. The envelope felt heavier than paper should. I turned it over in my hands, tracing the familiar loops of his handwriting, S.W., pressed deep into the wax seal. Samuel Whitmore, my husband, the man I thought I'd known better than myself. For a long moment, I just stared at it, my thumb resting on the seam. I could almost hear his voice again. Look behind the frames. All of them. And for the first time, I wondered if he'd been afraid when he said it. I broke the seal. The scent of old cedar and ink rose from the pages, the smell of his study, the smell of memory. Inside, folded neatly, was a letter written in the same pen he always used, the one I'd given him on our 20th anniversary. It began without greeting or preamble. No, my dear Eleanor, no. If you're reading this, I'm gone. Just truth, unadorned and shaking. My name was never Samuel Whitmore. I froze. He'd written it so plainly that my eyes almost refused to believe it. Before I met you, before the farmhouse, before the children, I was someone else. My name was Jack Landon. My hand trembled. The words blurred. Jack Landon. The name meant nothing, and yet everything in me recoiled, as if I'd just heard him admit to a second life. There was a woman once, Isabel Reyes. We were young, poor, and in love, the kind of love that feels invincible until the world reminds you it isn't. She died giving birth to our son. I named him Daniel, but the people she owed money to, they didn't forgive debt just because the debtor was dead. I pressed my fingers to my mouth. A faint ringing filled my ears. He'd never mentioned another woman. Never mentioned a child. They came for me next. said I was responsible for her loans. When I couldn't pay, they threatened to take Daniel, so I disappeared. I buried Jack Landon and became Samuel Whitmore. It wasn't bravery, Ellie. It was fear. A small metal key slipped from between the pages and clinked onto the table. Silver, worn, engraved with 3 words, for him. I found work under my new name. I built a life, a family. And for years I told myself that was redemption. But it was only escape. I searched for him every year since. I almost found him once in Georgia. Then I got sick, and I ran out of time. I read the letter 3 times before I realized I was crying. The words soaked into me, slow and heavy, like rain through old soil. He'd hidden a whole lifetime behind his eyes, behind his smile, behind every "I love you" that I'd never thought to question. I leaned back in the chair, letter in one hand, the key in the other, and let my gaze travel around the room. Our life, framed and hanging like trophies, suddenly looked different. Each. Picture wasn't proof of love anymore. It was camouflage. I remembered every strange moment I'd brushed aside. His hesitation when someone mentioned Savannah, the yearly donations to St. Anne's adoption services, the way he'd gone silent during lullabies when our children were small. They weren't quirks. They were guilt, the I. Line from his journal returned to me. Truth belongs to time, and time, it seemed, had finally decided to speak. I stood and crossed the room. There were more frames, dozens of them. I took down another, the photo from our trip to Nashville. The backing peeled away easily. Behind it, another envelope. This one held brittle papers, yellowed at the edges, adoption records, birth dates, transfer of custody, and at the bottom a signature that made my knees buckle, Jack Landon. I grabbed the nearest frame, a small one from Samuel's office. Inside, behind the photograph of a sunset, lay a tiny black and white baby picture, a newborn swaddled in a hospital blanket. The tag on his wrist barely visible. Across the bottom, faint but legible, was a name written in faded ink, Daniel Reyes, my husband's secret child, his lost son, the ghost that had followed our marriage from the very beginning. The room tilted around me. I sank into the chair, clutching the photograph against my chest. 40 years of certainty collapsed into something I couldn't name. Not betrayal exactly. Not anger, but something deeper. Grief for the man I thought I knew, and for the man he used to be. Outside, thunder rolled low against the Blue Ridge horizon. The key gleamed on the table under the lamplight, waiting for what came next. The number in Samuel's letter was nearly illegible, smudged by time, or maybe by his own hesitation. Still, I dialed. It rang twice before an old voice answered. Porter. For a moment I couldn't breathe. Mr. Porter. My name is Eleanor Whitmore. My husband left your name in a letter. There was a pause, the kind that carries memory. Then quietly, you're Samuel's wife. The way he said it told me he'd been expecting this call for years. Miles Porter lived 2 hours away in a small bungalow outside Raleigh. His voice was measured, clipped, the kind of tone belonging to men who've seen too many lies and no longer flinch at them. I thought I'd hear from you sooner, he said when I arrived. The place smelled of coffee and rain. Walls lined with old case files and fading certificates. He poured me a cup without asking. He was a stubborn man, your husband, but a good one, carried a burden longer than most could. What kind of burden? I asked. My voice didn't sound like mine. Miles pulled a worn folder from a drawer, its edges soft from handling. Inside, copies of adoption forms, a few old photographs, and a map with red pins across Georgia and the Carolinas. He came to me 10 years ago, Miles said, wanted to find his son. At first, he thought the boy was living under another name. But tracking children from the 70s, it's not simple. Records vanish. People reinvent themselves. He handed me a photo. A man in his 30s, sandy brown hair, a kind smile. He found him 6 months before he passed, Miles said softly. Your husband's son. His name's David Hale. Lives in Savannah, Georgia. I stared at the picture until the edges blurred. The resemblance was faint, but there. The same slope of the nose, the same calm in the eyes. He found him, I whispered. And never told me, Miles nodded slowly. He wanted to, but he was waiting for the right time. When the doctors gave him his diagnosis, he knew he'd never get to say it himself. My heart clenched. So he left it for me. Miles hesitated, then slid another document across the table, a printed email chain between Samuel and a local bank manager. Attached at the bottom was a note in Samuel's handwriting. Account number 794215 for David Hale. Do not release until confirmation of my passing. The balance, $280,000. My hands trembled. He saved this for him? Miles nodded. Every bit of overtime, every side project, every dollar he could spare. He wanted to make it right. I felt dizzy, not from betrayal this time, but from the weight of love twisted into secrecy. But love, even hidden, leaves ripples, and that night, those ripples reached my children. Caroline found me at the kitchen table. The letter spread open like evidence. Her face tightened the way it always did when she thought I was being naive. Mom, she said, this isn't healthy. You're grieving. You're letting some old man spin stories. It's not a story, I replied. It's your father's truth. Andrew arrived a few hours later, loud, practical, always certain. You can't just believe this, he said, waving the papers. Dad was sick. He might have imagined all of it. And even if it's real, you don't owe this stranger a dime, I wanted to shout. To tell them love doesn't vanish because it was complicated. Instead, I whispered, he's not a stranger. He's your half-brother. The silence that followed could have split the room in two. Caroline's eyes hardened. You need help, Mom. This is what grief does. It makes people vulnerable. Scammers thrive on that. She stormed out. Andrew followed, muttering about lawyers and protecting assets. When the door slammed, I felt something shift inside me, the same quiet defiance I'd felt the night Samuel died. They could doubt all they wanted. I had to see for myself. The next morning, I packed a small bag, a few clothes, the letter, the photograph of David Hale, and set out for Savannah. The drive stretched beneath a gray Carolina sky, rain tracing slow patterns on the windshield. Every mile hummed with questions I wasn't ready to answer. What if he didn't want to see me? What if he already knew who I was? What if Samuel's secret ruined another life before it could heal one? By the time I reached the old oak-lined streets of Savannah, dusk had settled in. The city glowed, soft lamplight. Magnolia trees dripping with rain. I parked in front of a narrow townhouse with a small porch and flowers in mismatched pots. My heart pounded so loud I could barely hear the crickets. I checked the letter one more. Time. The address scrawled in Samuel's neat hand. This was the place. I climbed the steps and knocked. Footsteps. A pause. The door opened. The man standing there looked to be in his late 30s. Casual shirt, worn hands, tired eyes. But it wasn't his face that stopped me. It was his eyes, that same steady blue-gray I'd stared into for 40 years, Samuel's eyes. Can I help you? He asked, and for a moment all I could do was whisper, You already have. David's porch smelled faintly of rain and pine. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. He looked at me like people look at strangers who say your name with too much familiarity. I'm sorry for showing up like this, I finally said, voice trembling. But I think my husband was your father. His brows furrowed. My father? I handed him the letter, the one Samuel had written with shaking hands. The one I still couldn't read without feeling the weight of every word. David invited me inside. The house was modest. Photographs lined the walls, all of them framed. And suddenly, that small detail hit me like a ghost of Samuel's voice. Look behind the frames. He sat across from me, studying the letter. When he finished, his fingers lingered on Samuel's signature. Then he stood and walked to a drawer by the window. From it, he pulled a faded photograph, the kind taken with disposable cameras decades ago. A man in uniform, younger, sharper, the same eyes. I was told this man abandoned us, David said quietly. My mother said he ran away after she was born. She died when I was 8. I grew up believing he didn't care. He turned the photo around, as if comparing it to my face, to the tremor in my voice, to the truth neither of us wanted to carry. That's him, I whispered. His name was Jack Landon before it was Samuel Whitmore. For a long time, the room was only breathing. Finally, David unfolded the letter again. His voice cracked as he read aloud. "Forgive me for saving you wrong." He stopped halfway through the sentence. The sound that escaped him wasn't a sob, but something quieter, grief realizing it had a body again. In that moment, I didn't see a stranger. I saw the child my husband had spent his life looking for, the one he'd carried in silence while pretending the weight was gone. He was dying, I said softly. He wanted peace. You were the last piece of it, David nodded, tears streaking down his face. I used to imagine what I'd say if I ever met him. I thought I'd scream. I thought I'd ask why. But now I wish I could tell him I understand. We sat there in the hush of a life neither of us had planned. The sound of rain against the window felt like the world slowing down to let the truth breathe. Then my phone rang. Caroline's name flashed on the screen. I hesitated before answering. Mom? Her voice was sharp, cold. Please tell me you didn't actually go see him. Caroline, Unbelievable. You drove to another state to meet some stranger who probably Googled Dad's obituary. Do you hear how insane that sounds? Her words stung because I'd once been that kind of logical, the kind that confuses control for safety. Caroline, I said quietly, this man isn't lying. He's your father's son. Mom, stop it, she snapped. Dad's gone. You're making a fool of yourself chasing ghosts. The line went dead. For a few seconds, the silence between me and David carried every ounce of that pain. He looked at me with something like pity, not the kind that belittles, but the kind that understands. I'm sorry, he murmured. Don't be, I said, though the ache in my chest said otherwise. They just don't understand what truth costs. Outside, thunder rumbled. A storm had rolled in from the coast. I stood, thanking him for listening, for believing what even my children refused to. He walked me to the door, and before I left he said, If you find anything else, let me know. I want to know who he was, not the stories, the man. I nodded. He would have liked that. As I stepped into the rain, headlights flashed down the street. Miles Porter's old sedan pulling up, windshield wipers thudding in rhythm. He rolled the window down just enough for his voice to carry. You should see this, he said. It's about Samuel. What is it? I asked, heart racing again. I authenticated his letter. And Eleanor? He looked straight at me, eyes solemn. I found something else, records that confirm Jack Landon didn't die in that fire. Your husband's story checks out, down to the date. The storm wind tugged at my coat. Behind me, David stood in the doorway, the living echo of a man who'd kept his secret too well. Somewhere between grief and revelation, I realized the truth wasn't haunting me anymore. It was calling me forward. It started with a letter from Caroline's lawyer. I didn't even know she'd hired one until I opened the envelope. The words felt colder than the February air that morning. All financial assets under the name of the late Samuel Whitmore are to be held pending investigation into potential fraud. Fraud. The word sliced deeper than any grief had. I sat at the kitchen table, the same table where Caroline had once done her homework, her little legs swinging beneath the chair. Now her signature sat beside her attorney's, bold, deliberate, merciless. By noon, Andrew had stopped returning my calls. By evening, I learned he'd been the one who told the paper. The headline hit like a hammer. Widow discovers husband's secret family. Possible scam inheritance? They used a photo of me leaving the courthouse after Samuel's death certificate hearing. Eyes swollen, hair uncombed, clutching a folder like a lifeline. I didn't recognize the woman in that picture. Maybe that was the point. When the first reporter called, I hung up. When the second called, I told them Samuel wasn't a criminal, that he was trying to make something right. But they twisted. Even that. The article painted me as a grieving woman, clinging to a fantasy crafted by opportunists. Caroline's quote was there too, sharp and precise. My mother's not well. She's been manipulated by people who know she's vulnerable. I read it twice before realizing my hands were shaking too badly to hold the phone. For days, the house was silent except for the hum of the refrigerator and the faint echo of Samuel's voice in my memory. Sometimes I'd catch myself whispering to the walls, "I'm not crazy, Sam. I know what I saw." But silence can turn even faith into doubt. And one night, I almost believed them, believed that maybe the grief had finally cracked something in me. Then Miles called, his voice, steady as always, carried something new that night, a calm urgency. "Eleanor," he said, "I found something. You need to hear it in person." He arrived an hour later with his old leather briefcase and eyes that had seen too many confessions. He didn't sit right away. Instead, he pulled out a small recorder and set it on the table between us. "This was Samuel's," he said quietly. "He recorded a call a few days before he passed. He told me to hold on to it until you were ready." I stared at the device, heart pounding. Ready for what? He pressed play, a soft click. Then Samuel's voice, rough, weak, but unmistakably his. "If she finds him, tell her I finally found peace." The sound of his breathing filled the space between the words, slow and uneven. Then silence. I closed my eyes, pressing a hand against my chest, like I could steady the ache inside it. It wasn't proof for a court. It was proof for my soul. What neither of us realized was that Caroline had come by earlier to drop off a signed affidavit and had forgotten her keys. She'd walked in quietly, calling my name once before stopping in the hallway. Now she stood there, halfway between anger and disbelief, listening to her father's voice for the first time since the funeral. When the recording ended, she didn't speak right away. Her eyes glistened. That's really him," I nodded. "It's him, sweetheart. He wanted you to know he wasn't running away. He was running towards something. Someone." Caroline looked at me like a daughter again, not a plaintiff. Her chin trembled. "I didn't want to believe you because it meant Dad wasn't who I thought he was." But hearing him say that, she stopped. The tears came fast, unguarded. Miles stepped quietly outside, leaving us alone. I reached across the table and took her hand. For the first time in months, she didn't pull away. "We don't have to understand it all," I whispered. "We just have to let it be true." Caroline nodded, crying silently, her fingers clutching mine like a lifeline she'd almost cut herself free from. As the recorder clicked off, the light on it blinked twice, a small digital heartbeat. Miles returned, his expression grave. "There's more," he said. "Another file. But it's not from your husband. It's from someone who knew the real Jack Landon." Eleanor looked up slowly, the warmth of her daughter's hand still in hers, and a new wave of questions waiting at the door. Caroline arrived first. Andrew followed 10 minutes later, shoulders tight, eyes unreadable. I'd invited them both without saying who else would be there. I needed them to see him, not through my words, but through their own eyes. When the doorbell rang, no one moved. I opened it, and there stood David Hale, holding a slim folder and a quiet nervousness that reminded me so much of Samuel that for a heartbeat, I forgot how to breathe. He looked at my children like someone approaching a graveyard, cautious, reverent, uncertain if peace or ghosts would rise first. "Caroline, Andrew," I said softly. "This is David." They nodded stiffly, the air brittle with everything unsaid. Sat around the dining table, the same table where Caroline once blew out birthday candles, and where Andrew learned his first multiplication. Tables. No one spoke for a long while. The tick of the clock became unbearable. Then David slid the folder forward. Inside, photocopies of adoption records, an infant photo, a notarized statement from the state of Georgia. He pointed gently to one line. "Mother, Isabel Reyes. Birthplace, Savannah General Hospital." Caroline's lips parted slightly. Andrew leaned forward, brow furrowed. "And here," David said, unfolding another document. "This was found in my file, a handwritten note from the orphanage director. It says the father, Jack Landon, was presumed dead." The paper trembled slightly in his hands. No one corrected the tremor. For a moment, no one could look at each other. It was Caroline who finally broke the silence. "So you're saying Dad faked his death to protect you?" David hesitated, searching for words that didn't sound like accusations. "I'm saying he loved me enough to give me up. And maybe he loved you enough to never tell you why." The words fell like stones. Heavy, simple, true. Caroline lowered her gaze. Blinking hard, Andrew leaned back, exhaling slowly, the anger leaking out of him like air from a punctured tire. "You have his eyes," he said finally. It wasn't an accusation. It was surrender. I remembered then, years ago, Samuel teaching them both how to skip stones on the pond behind our house. He'd told them, "A promise is only as strong as your reason for keeping it." At the time, I thought he was talking about childhood secrets, spilled jam jars and hidden report cards. But now, sitting here with 3 fragments of his life gathered in one room, I realized he'd been speaking about this, the impossible balance between protection and truth. Caroline's voice cracked. "All these years, I thought he was just distant. That he didn't trust us, but maybe he was, carrying this." Andrew nodded, eyes glistening. "He wanted us all safe," he said quietly. "He just didn't know how." I reached across the table and took both their hands, my children on one side, his child on the other, the past finally touching itself without breaking. For a few moments, no one spoke. The air softened, grief and grace folding together like morning light through old curtains. Then I stood and walked to the cabinet in the corner. From the back, behind Samuel's old fishing license and a stack of yellowed tax forms, I pulled out a small black folder, the one labeled Estate, Private. Inside, a bank certificate, $280,000, Samuel's secret savings. I laid it gently on the table. "This," I said, my voice steady, "was never meant for me. He wanted it to find its way to the son he lost and the family he left behind. That means all of us now." David's eyes widened. "Mrs. Whitmore," "Eleanor," I corrected softly. "If we're going to rebuild something from all this, we start with truth. And that means no more secrets." Caroline wiped her eyes, nodding slowly. Andrew reached for David's hand, tentative, awkward, but real. For the first time, the table that had felt haunted for months finally felt whole again. I looked at all 3 of them, my late husband's past and future sitting side by side, and said quietly, "It's time to fulfill Samuel's last wish." Outside, the wind shifted, brushing against the windows like a whisper that had finally found its way home. The cemetery was quiet that morning, a kind of quiet that doesn't just live in the air, but in the bones. Autumn leaves whispered across the gravel as we walked the narrow path toward Samuel's grave. For the first time in months, we weren't fighting. We weren't questioning. We were simply coming home. The headstone stood beneath a sycamore tree, its bark pale and flaking like old parchment. Samuel. Whitmore, beloved husband and father. The dates carved below felt too small to contain the life he had led, or the lives he had. David carried a single photograph in his hand, the same one we'd found behind the frame all those weeks. A Guarata baby with dark eyes, smiling faintly, wrapped in a hospital blanket. He knelt and placed it against the gravestone. "I never knew you," he whispered, voice trembling. "But I think I understand you now." No one spoke. Even the breeze paused, as if listening. Caroline stood behind him, her face pale but soft. When she finally spoke, her voice cracked under the weight of everything she hadn't said. "I thought you were losing your mind." "Mom," she admitted, "I thought grief made you imagine things. Turns out," she swallowed hard, "you were the only one seeing clearly." I turned to her, tears blurring the edges of the world. For so long, her doubt had cut deeper than any stranger's cruelty. Hearing her say that felt like breathing again after months underwater. Andrew stepped forward next. He looked at David, really looked at him, then extended his hand. "Welcome home," he said quietly. David hesitated for just a moment before shaking it. Their hands met. 2 brothers bound not by blood alone, but by the same man's secret love. And for the first time, Samuel's grave didn't feel like an ending. It felt like a door finally closing so another could open. Miles Porter arrived a few minutes later, his old sedan crunching the gravel. He carried a small safety deposit box tucked under his arm, the one we'd all been too afraid to open. "Mrs. Whitmore," he said, nodding respectfully. "I figured this belonged here." He set it on the grass and opened it carefully. Inside, nestled in a velvet pouch, was a single pendant, delicate, worn, and engraved with two names, Isabel and Eleanor. I gasped softly. 2 women. 2 lives. One man who had loved them both in different lifetimes. Miles smiled faintly. He asked me to deliver it only when everyone was together. Said it would make sense then. Caroline reached out and touched the pendant gently. "It's beautiful," she whispered. "It's his way of saying thank you," I murmured. "For letting him be whole, even after he was gone." The 4 of us stood there for a long time, the autumn wind wrapping around, us like an unseen embrace. Words were needed anymore. Every secret had found its place. Every wound had begun to close. I knelt and pressed my hand against the cool stone. "You kept him safe, Sam," I whispered. "I brought him home." The clouds shifted, and a shaft of sunlight broke through, spilling over the grass like a quiet benediction. And in that moment, for the first time since the night he died, I felt peace. Not pain fill the empty space beside me. Sometimes, the truth doesn't tear families apart. Sometimes, it brings them back together, frame by frame, name by name, memory by memory, until what's left is love in its purest form, honest, unhidden, and finally free. It's been 6 months since that morning at the cemetery. 6 months since forgiveness stopped being a word and started becoming a daily practice. The farmhouse feels lighter now. Sunlight reaches corners that used to live in shadow. Even the ticking clock in the hallway, once a sound of loneliness, feels like rhythm again, steady and kind. I've redecorated the living room, not to forget Samuel, but to remember him differently. The old wallpaper is gone. The walls are a soft cream now, quiet enough to hold new memories. On one wall hang 2 frames, side by side. The first holds our wedding portrait, Samuel and me beneath that Carolina oak, his arm wrapped around me. My veil caught in the breeze. The second is new, a photo taken last Sunday in the garden. Caroline, Andrew, David, and his 2 children, little Emma clutching her grandfather's pendant, Jacob grinning shyly beside her, and me standing in the center, smiling through tears the camera couldn't see. For years, I thought pictures captured moments. Now I understand. They capture promises, some broken, some kept, and some we don't realize we've made until time tells us what they meant. Sometimes I still talk to him. When the house is too quiet or the night feels too long, I look up at those frames and whisper, "You'd like how it turned out. Sam, you'd finally sleep easy." Now, it's strange, grief no longer feels heavy. It feels honest, like a shadow that walks beside me instead of over me. People in town still ask questions. The newspaper story about the man with 2 names made its rounds, and strangers look at me like I've survived something impossible. Maybe I have, but what I really did was listen. Sometimes love doesn't lie, I tell them. It hides to protect, to preserve, to survive. But truth, I always pause here. Truth waits. Truth waited 40 years to be heard, and when it finally spoke, it didn't sound like accusation or guilt. It sounded like peace. Caroline comes by every weekend now, bringing fresh flowers and laughter. Andrew helps David rebuild the porch swing that once carried Samuel and me through our summer evenings. And little Emma draws pictures of everyone holding hands, labeling them our family, with no line separating anyone. The other day she asked me, "Grandma, who's the man in the old picture?" I told her, "That's the man who made all of this possible." She smiled and said, "He must have loved us a lot." "Yes," I said softly. "He just loved in complicated ways." In the evenings, I sit on the porch with a cup of tea, watching the sun melt into the Carolina horizon. The world feels both bigger and gentler now, like it knows I've seen the worst of love and still believe in it. I forgive Samuel, not for lying, but for loving too fiercely to tell the truth. I've learned that love, in its truest form, isn't about perfection, it's about preservation, even when it means hiding pieces of yourself for the sake of others. And when I glance up at those frames, the past and the present hanging side by side, I realize something beautiful. Grief built a wall between who we were and who we've become, but truth turned it into a window. If this story touched you, if you've ever loved, lost or forgiven someone a little too late, remember, every truth finds its moment. Some just take longer to arrive. Subscribe to Her Side of the Story, where every chapter reminds us that wisdom doesn't fade with age. It just learns to speak softly and let time do the shouting.